Hey, everybody. Thanks again for joining me for Think Your Way to an Epic Life. And today we have a really big treat for everybody. This is the guy who got inducted into the Hall of Fame of podcasters. And I'm embarrassed to say, I don't know what that is yet, but we're going to find out. He has written a book and he also has a podcast by the same name of the book. And I've listened to a couple of those. And so it's the School of Podcasts. So, Dave, thank you. I can't thank you enough for being here today. Welcome.
Oh, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
Me too. So, what inspired you to start podcasting in 2005?
Yeah, my background's in education. So I have gray hair, so it means I've been doing this a while, and I actually taught people like how to surf the internet and how to send email and things like that. So I'd always been in technology, and I'm also a musician. And so I had a friend of mine that was into marketing for musicians, and I had a blog and I had a website and all this, and he came back and said, "Hey, I've just seen the next big thing." And I go, "What is it?" And he goes, "Podcasting." And I went to Google and I typed in podcasting and there was 1.5 pages. And I go, "Wait, how do you spell that again?" And I type and I go, "I think we broke the internet. There's nothing about this on the internet." And so I had just seen so many, like I'd hear this is going to be, MySpace is going to be the next big thing. And I would go, "Yeah, whatever." And so I'd seen so many things kind of just pass me by. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to jump in on this one. At the time, they were saying membership sites were going to be the next big thing. And then this guy says podcasting is going to be the next big thing. And back then, you kind of had to rubber band and paper clips to get one together. And so when I finally uploaded a file and I saw it come back down on my computer, I went, "Oh, I get what this is." And then what really just where I grabbed my flag and I'm like, okay, I claim podcasting in the name of Dave. I had started this podcast for musicians. I was just taking my blog and repurposing it. And a guy from Nuremberg, Germany, Michael Van Laar, sent me a voicemail. And I was like, wait a minute, there's a guy on the other side of the planet, because I'm in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And he not only found my show, but liked it and then sent me a voicemail. And I went, whoa. And so for me, it was, there's no rules. You can do whatever you want. So there was that. So you could be as creative as you want. And then it was kind of back then a little more technical than it was. So it scratched my technical itch. And then the fact that it enabled me to teach. So it's one of those things, it depends on who has the tool, what something does. So if you give a podcast to a teacher, he's like, "Oh, we can all learn from each other." And if you give it to somebody in sales, they're going to go, "We can market to everyone." And if you give it to, so it's always interesting seeing what different people do with it. But yeah, so I got involved, and it was the early days were really, really painful, because you'd ask somebody, "Do you listen to podcasts?" And they go, "Do you need an iPod for that?" I'm like, "Oh, no, just the speakers and the internet." But it was a fun way, and just watching it grow and grow and grow over the last 18 years has been a lot of fun.
Well, you set me up perfectly for the next question, which is like, what are the biggest things that have changed over all these years?
Yeah, the biggest one is when I started, it wasn't in there was no Apple Podcast yet. And it was weird because there was Yahoo had a directory. There was this thing called Audio, was a big, like a phone book of podcasts. And Apple came on board, and I remember looking at my stats, and it was the only hockey stick growth. Like it was like, boom, and Steve Jobs announced it, and that whole 9 yards. That was probably one of the biggest ones. And what was interesting is all those other people went, "Oh, Apple's here, never mind." So like Yahoo went away, and this thing called Audio, which was really popular at the time, it went away, but it had this whole thing about following each other on it. And so it came back later. They just rebranded to Twitter. So Twitter started out as a podcast directory. So they came back, but Microsoft folded. A bunch of other people just went, never mind. So that was that. And it's been slowly growing every year, but it's like, 2 to 5%. It's not these leaps and bounds over the years. But then, and I forget what year it was, it's probably longer than I thought, but when Serial came out is when I think it really went mainstream. Because over the years, we've had different kind of, first it was all the geeks, because you had to be a geek to make one. So all the technical people were doing that. And then there were a lot of language podcasts. And then the comedians came. And then Serial came in and launched the true crime. And when I saw, because occasionally you would hear the word podcast like on the news or something, but when Serial came on board, it was so popular. And I had like 5 different people like, hey, you're the podcast guy. Have you heard this thing called Serial? And when I finally listened to it, I was like, wow, it's just the epitome of what's going to happen next. And you didn't know what to expect. And when I saw them parody it on Saturday Night Live, I'm like, this is different. Like Saturday Night Live is about as mainstream as you can get. And they're talking about podcasting. So, and then just over the years, all of a sudden you started hearing the news go, thanks for tuning in tonight. Tune into our podcast. And so all of a sudden everybody had podcasts, and celebrities started getting involved. Adam Carolla and Ricky Gervais, and then Mark Maron came on board. He kind of lifted things up, and over the years, it's just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So, but I think we're up to 74% of Americans now listen to a podcast at least once a month. So
Wow. You got in on the ground floor.
Yeah, I was probably one of the first, because I started in April of 2005. And even though it was invented somewhere around 2000, it didn't really, people didn't really start going, hey, let's use this technology till around 2004. So it was invented by 2 guys. One guy was named Dave Weiner, who wrote, we're going to get kind of geeky here, this thing called RSS, which is what all blogs ran on. And then the other guy you might remember from MTV is Adam Curry, who is also a big giant nerd. And he was like, wait, what if we take this blogging thing and somehow attached it to where media could be, associated to that. So when the iPod came out, he's like, oh, wait a minute, that's the new radio. Like if we can get this content to somehow end up on that thing, that's going to be the new radio. So yeah, it was, and what was really interesting, I remember the very first podcast event in Ontario, California, and you're talking maybe 60, 70 people. And what was interesting is back then we all listened to each other's shows because there just weren't that many. And I remember there was a guy named C.C. Chapman, and he did a music show. Back then there were actually musicians there was this big directory where people would go, here, just play my music. It's yours. Just take it and tell people to go to my website. And so he had a show, and he walked in, and we're in this little inky, Holiday Inn in Ontario, California. He goes, yeah. And we're all in the bar, of course. And he walks in, he's like, hey, I'm looking for the podcast thing. And we're like, oh, this is it. And he's like, oh, great. Like, who are you? And he said, oh, I'm CC Chapman. And it was like Cheers, like when they used to scream out, Norm, he's like, oh, I'm CC Chapman. And we were like, oh, CC. So it was like this little brotherhood of everybody, like, oh, have you tried this? Oh, this works to do this. And this is how I'm promoting it. And I never thought of doing this and that whole 9 yards. So, and that's really hasn't changed. It's, there are definitely more kind of corporate people involved, but at its core, if you get a bunch of podcasters together, they'll all, if I use this company for merch and this didn't work, and then I tried this, and, we're sharing what works, because with radio, there is a competition because you're both on at 7:30, Monday through Friday. But some of my best friends are my competition because you can listen to me on Monday, you can listen to Daniel on Tuesday, you can listen to Ray on Wednesday, et cetera, et cetera. So it's one of the funnest parts, I think, of podcasting is the community.
So is that what made you decide to create the School of Podcasting?
No, my background again was in teaching, and the bad news about being a corporate trainer. So I taught a lot of Microsoft Office and QuickBooks and customer service and time management, all that kind of stuff. But the bad news is about every 7 years, whatever company I worked for, they would hire a bunch of sales guys that couldn't sell training for whatever reason. Now, in my world, I would go, maybe you should get some new sales guys. But they didn't. What they would do is they would downsize the training department. So I saw us go from 5 trainers to 4 to 3, and I was like, oh, here we go. And so I had already been podcasting for about 10 years at that point. Let me think about this. Well, no, the School of Podcasting was launched in 2005. It was just, I was going to get another degree. So my original degree was in electronic engineering. How I ended up in training, you put me in any company, I'll end up in the marketing department and the training department. That's just my strengths. But I went to get another teaching job, and I didn't have a teaching degree. And I'm like, look at my resume. And they're like, you have to go get the piece of paper. And so I was a waiter getting my first degree in engineering. I'm like, well, I need a job to keep me in books and phone and insurance and stuff like that. And so I was like, and it's the worst. I always tell people, whatever you do, if the goal is to make a lot of money quickly, podcasting is not the way to do it. But that's exactly what I was trying. And this is in 2005, which is why, in addition to starting a membership site, I was also designing websites. I was playing in a band. I was giving guitar lessons. I had many, many odd jobs to do that. So yeah, that came along shortly thereafter. And again, I had no idea. I've never launched some sort of paid website. All my stuff was just blogging and stuff. So, and then along the way, and this is what every podcaster needs. You need somebody to tell you the truth. This is the one step that everybody misses, because it's so hard when you first do that first episode, because you're kind of churning your way through the learning curve. And finally, I had a friend of mine that said, because I was charging $5, because I was like, wow, if I could get 100 people to, give me $5, this would be great. And my friend said, hey, Dave, can you name anything on the internet that's not a total waste of time for $5? And I go, no. And he goes, yeah. He goes, you have a perception problem. He goes, I've seen your stuff. He goes, it's worth way more than $5. And I was like, oh, okay. And so as I just started raising my price, and it was weird. It didn't make sense. But the higher I raised my price, in some case, well, definitely the more people I got. But even at $20 a month, I would have people sign up, and they would, sign up. I'd get their money, and they wouldn't do anything. And I'm like, well, the marketing part of this was, you're supposed to get a podcast and publish it. And then people are going to go, hey, where did you learn how to podcast? And they'd go, Dave Jackson, here he has an affiliate program. Use my link. And they weren't doing that. They were just giving me $20 for nothing, which on one hand, money for nothing. Who doesn't want that? But that wasn't part of the plan. So eventually when I got up to around 50, and then now I'm at 79, I have people that actually sign up, and then they actually do stuff, which is great. So that's how that was started, and all the growing pains of launching a membership site.
I can so back you up on that. When I owned my own Remax, and I had been a millionaire real estate agent, and I had all these things, I was a qualifying broker, no one would listen to me. Now that I'm a coach and they pay me, they do everything I say. They hardly will make a move without me. So people don't value what they don't pay for. And that's really a shame, isn't it?
Yeah, it was bizarre. It just doesn't, logically, it doesn't make sense, but it is what it is. So, and I get that. I know, a friend of mine just told me about some new website that's supposed to be the new Amazon killer. Like, it's super cheap, and people are drop shipping things from China and stuff. And I went over, and it was like, wait, I can get a sweatshirt that I normally pay, somewhere between $18 to $25 for like $7. And I was like, yeah, that can't be any good. And I was like, here we go again with the perceived value. So it is one of those things. And pricing, I know, for all entrepreneurs, it's funny. We all undervalue because, well, it's just stuff I know. I had a friend of mine, again, my background's in music. And the one day I said something about Pete Best. Did you have any idea who Pete Best is?
No.
See, nobody. And to me, I'm like, how do you not know who Pete Best is? And when we surround ourselves, I'll answer that question in a second, but when we surround ourselves who know the same things we do, we don't put any value to it, because everybody knows that. Pete Best was the original drummer in the Beatles before Ringo.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so to me, I'm like, how do you not know that? But it's so I remember once I said that, my friend's like, how do you know this stuff? And I was like, everybody knows who Pete Best is. And she said, no, they don't. You're weird. Like, where do you get this word trivia? And so when you let's say you're, a selling person, or, you really know about whatever your specialty is, and you probably hang out with other people that like that topic, because birds of a feather. And so consequently, you end up not charging enough because you think everybody knows this stuff.
That is very fascinating. So if someone is brand new to podcasting, or they have 300 podcasts under their belt, what will they learn by going to the School of Podcasting?
Well, the first thing they're going to get is all the low-hanging fruit that they didn't see because they're too close to it. I'll give you an example. I still look at this and go, that did not happen, but it did about a month and a half ago. So I've been podcasting for 18 years, and this recently I kind of updated my description and a couple other things. I always say your podcast is not a statue, it's a recipe, and you can change it anytime you want. And the last time I changed it, I had a typo in the name of my show. It said School of Podcasting, plan, launch, grow, monetize your show. And this friend said, hey, Dave, you know I love you. And I'm like, yes. And she goes, you have a typo. And I go, in what podcast? She goes, the School of Podcasting. And I'm like, no way. And there it was. So the first thing you're going to get is any kind of low hanging fruit. I know a lot of people there's a feature in many media hosts that you kind of can make a set it and forget it. You go and you say, give me a player of all my episodes. And they will take that and they will throw that on their website. And sure, people can listen to it. They often forget to put links to follow. So I have to keep going back to your website, which is on one hand a marketing strategy, but on the other hand, you're making it harder for your audience. But the other thing is there is zero SEO in that. It's like absolute zero. Whereas if you treat every episode like a blog post, well, now your description that you typed in, that's your blog post. You embed a player. The words attract Google. When Google sends people to your website and they click play, they sit there and listen for 13 minutes maybe. And Google goes, that's funny. Every time I send something over to Kara's site, they're there for a while. That must be really good stuff. So your SEO goes up. And so just stuff like that you just go that, or a really common podcasting mistake. And it's not the end of the world. It just makes you sound a little less professional. So it'd be like, hey, today, we have Dave on the show. He's this guy, School of Podcasting, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, here's my talk with Dave. And how does it start off? Today we're talking with Dave Jackson. I'm like, you just introduced me twice. I don't know if you realize that or not, but like we only need once. So we help you find the stuff that might need a little polish, but we also then help you go, wow, that was really good. Like that was awesome. And then the other thing is, what I love is the community. A lot of people come for the courses and you get unlimited coaching, but we have a community of everybody from psychologists to retired pastors to comedy writers to pilots and so we're all together helping each other make the best content that's going to positively impact our audience. So a lot of times what I see a lot is, hey, I'm working on my artwork for my podcast. Which one do you like better? And so you get people that will, help you pick the best one. So it's a lot of fun. I'm traveling this week, and Friday I'm going to be going to a thing called Pod Indie to speak. And every Friday we have lunch with Dave, which is just an hour, sit around and, what's going on. And hey, I had a question about this YouTube thing. And I was going to cancel it. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to leave earlier. And we're doing lunch with Dave from a McDonald's somewhere between here and Indy. I'm going to stop at, 12:30 and make sure that meeting happens because I really, really do enjoy it. So it's a lot of fun. And then, some people are in different spots. Some people need help, getting it up and going. Other people need help growing it. And they didn't realize, wait, there's more than Apple and Spotify where I can list my show. Yeah, there's about 15 other ones in countries all over the world. And then some people are like, well, I want to monetize my show. And the first thing we have to look at is, okay, do you have an audience? Because you kind of can't monetize dust. So it might be we're trying to skip the grow phase. But if you want to monetize, there are like 7 different strategies you can use to monetize. And it's usually not one. It's usually not, oh, I'm going to have ads. It's like, well, you could have ads and maybe affiliate marketing, maybe do a little crowdfunding. There are all sorts of different strategies that you can do to raise some money if that's the thing you want to do. I've one guy, Craig, does livewelandflourish.com. And I was like, hey, you got it off the ground. I'm like, what's the strategy here? And he's like, I really could care less about making money with my podcast. He goes, I just want people to live well and flourish. And I'm like, well, there you go. So it's a fun group and it's just, I love it because it scratches my teaching itch.
Okay. So you said unlimited coaching. What does that mean?
That means
as a coach, that is horrifying.
Well, it is. And it was for me. And I was looking around because the podcast coaching space was getting a little crowded. Like if somebody had 3 episodes, they're like, well, I'm a podcast consultant now. And I was like, okay. And I looked around and I was like, okay, I see what you're doing there. Got it. And I was like, what can I do that they can't? Like, what's the thing? And I was like, let's see, married with kids, married with kids, married with kids, married with kids. Oh, I am single. I have no children. I have no spouse. And I was like, I have a lot more free time on their hand. And the other thing was I was spending a ton of time, trying to get people to sign up because I had the big ticket, you could do one-on-one coaching with me. And I would go and like, hey, I see you have this business. You should start a podcast, yada, yada, yada. 4 days of back and forth answering questions for free to finally get them to hire me for an hour. I'd answer all their podcast questions and off they'd go. And I was like, well, I really like that teaching part. I want to do more of that. And it dawned on me that the amount of time I was spending getting that person to hire me for an hour, I was like, that's really not that big a ticket anymore. You wasted a lot of time getting that person to sign up. And I was like, I already have people here that are giving me money. Why don't I just do what I love and say, hey, does anybody need any coaching? And I was like, this doesn't scale though. You're outnumbered, Dave. This is not going to scale. And I'm like, let's jump off that bridge when we get to it, shall we? And so I just announced, hey, if you guys need, here's my calendar. Here's when I'm available. And if you can't find a time when I'm available, let me know, but we'll figure something out. But if you just want a quick half hour, hey, Dave, I have a question. How do I do this thing? And it's interesting because some people use it a ton. I have one guy that we meet every Monday. We did that for about 6 weeks and he's like, okay, I think I'm good. And then other people are like, no, I'm good. Because I've got courses that kind of answer all those questions anyway. And so I just threw it on the wall and I was like, let's see what happens. This could blow up in my face or not. But if it blows up in my face, oh, doggone it, I'm going to do what I love all the time. What a horrible thing. And so far, the only thing that it kind of, from a marketing standpoint, I don't have a big ticket item anymore. Like, what am I going to offer for the big ticket? Oh, consulting? No, you just gave that away. And I was like, you know what? I'm okay. I'm okay with that. It's working good. And it's also what you're doing is I'm building relationships with people a little deeper than I used to. And so they stick around a lot longer. So the amount of money of a lifetime customer has gone up. So I'm like, okay, so far it's working. So we'll see what happens. But it could have easily blown up in my face. And I hadn't really thought that through. I'm like, well, if I really get to the point where I can't keep up, there are people in the school of podcasting that have been around forever. And I could have easily, knighted them. Here, you are a deputy of the school of podcasting. I'm going to pay you because now I've got so many people. I've got the income. I will just have somebody come on and be my assistant coach, and go that route. But so far I haven't had to go that route yet.
Well, it seems like that was a very wise thing to put. This is the limit. These are the times that I'm available. Not like you can keep me for 10 hours.
Yeah.
I've got
and any time I ever need a break, I just block off a day. Like, this is where Dave takes a break. And I also let them know because I do travel a fair amount. So I'm like, hey, this Saturday I'm not available or this and that. And then the other thing is I do have this awesome community. So a lot of times what I do is if somebody asks me a question, they're like, hey, like I have like a $200 budget. What's the best microphone? And I'll go, that's a great question. Can you ask that in the community? And I will answer it there. And so I'm training my people to ask the questions in the community, and I will happily go over and answer that. But what happens sometimes is before I get a chance to answer, somebody else already has. And so now I've got them all coaching each other. And then I come in and go, yep, that's a great idea. Just be sure, don't do that with the thing because you didn't know that. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. So it's a strategy that's working well.
This is awesome. That is absolutely brilliant. Okay. So you wrote this book called Profit from Your Podcast. What's the overview of that? Why should we buy that book?
Yeah, this is for the person that they'd be podcasting for, 4 years. And I'm like, so what's the goal? And they're like, well, I'd like to monetize this thing sometime. And I'm like, great. So what are you doing? And they're like, well, no advertisers. And I'm like, okay, but like, what else are you doing? They're like, well, what else is there? And I was like, wait, there's many other ways, many better ways to monetize your show than just ads. And so what I did is I just put the word out. I said, hey, if you're making a dime with your podcast, I want to interview you. I'm going to write a book. I'd already written a book years before called More Podcast Money. And then I was approached by a publisher because I was getting ready to kind of update that. And a publisher approached me and said, would you like to write a book on podcast monetization? I'm like, well, funny, you should ask. I'm in the middle of this already. And so that's where, it's everything for the most profitable way is to sell your own products or service. And the reason for that is when one of the things we talk about is having a consistent schedule with consistent value. So that could be once a week. It could be 5 days a week if you're going to do these little baby shows and you just want to keep your brand in front of people. Whatever it is, have a consistent schedule. And then anytime you can make a point by telling a personal story. So one example, when Muhammad Ali died, when I was growing up, he was like champ forever. And there was so much more to that guy than being a boxer. And when he died, I was seriously like, that was one of my heroes. So I did an episode about here are 10 things podcasters can learn from Muhammad Ali. Number 1, always promoting. Number 2, completely unique. Number 3, et cetera, et cetera. And so I shared a story through my life, but it was still talking about podcasting. And so I had people that were like, hey, Dave, he was my champ too. Well, now I've got a conversation going with my audience. So anytime you can kind of explain things without just talking about, your cat for no apparent reason, make it pointed to the topic. And so now they get to know you. And then when your show's good, and if it's not good, well, they're not listening. So we know it's good. Then they kind of trust you. So now you've got the whole know, like, and trust. So that when you say, oh, I've got a coaching program, I've got a new book, I'm doing a webinar, whatever it is, a chunk of those people are going to buy that because it's a warm lead at this point. They trust you. They like you. And so that's why selling your own stuff is good. But you can also do a fair amount with affiliate marketing where you're selling other people's stuff. And then there is crowdfunding. There are people that are making 5 figures a month crowdfunding. And so
what is that?
That's the whole Patreon, Supercast, Glow.fm, where basically most of it is, hey, it's either additional episodes or it's ad-free episodes or it's access to you. I talk about Jonathan Oakes in the book. He does Trivia Warfare. And part of it is if you, at these different tiers, like you actually get to help shape the show. Like what's the next topic we're going to talk about? So this is where your super fans that really want to get involved. Now it's amazing. The sad stat that came out of that is somewhere between 3 to maybe, if you're really good, 5% of your audience will become part of your crowd that's funding you. But it's another, again, depending on the size of your audience, I make like a card payment every month on one show. I use crowdfunding for that. Then you get into ads, and ads, the thing that most people ignore is I work for a company called Libsyn. We announced that, 9% of podcasts get enough downloads to get, for lack of a better phrase, a big sponsor, the Better Helps, the, Progressive Insurance, things like that. But that means 90% of people don't. And that doesn't mean you can't have ads. I get nowhere near 10,000 downloads an episode, but I've still had sponsors on my show because I had microphone manufacturers and all sorts of podcasting related stuff that were trying to get to my audience, which were podcasters. So, and because I have that niche audience, I can charge more, even though it's a smaller audience. It's like, no, we really need, oh, you guys have podcasters? I got a new microphone. I need to get to those guys. I'm like, well, it's going to cost you. So you can still have ads, and those are fine. Just don't use the radio model. In radio, you sell things based on per 1,000 listeners, and it's CPM. It's like cost per mille, which I think is Italian for 1,000 or something like that. It's something that just transferred over from radio, and that doesn't work for hardly any podcasters. Have a flat fee for the episode, sell them, a couple months, and then also do the old trick of like, well, what would you like to sponsor? The podcast, the website, or the newsletter? Oh, by the way, we're having a special right now. Buy 3 months and we'll give you all 3 for the one low price. Because newsletters are another thing. If you want to monetize, start your newsletter now. And my newsletter is the dumbest thing ever. It's about a paragraph and a half of like, hey, I came back from Cincinnati and I learned this, blah, blah, blah. Here's a link to it. And then it's just, and here's my latest episodes. Bing, 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 just links at the bottom. Hey, do you need one-on-one coaching? It's still here. Do this. And that's it. And I've had people say, I like your newsletter. It takes like 2 minutes to read it. But it's, I still have people at the bottom. Would you like help with your podcast? And I have that tagged so I know it came from my newsletter. So there are ads. I'm not anti-ad. I'm just letting you know that most people can't get the big ones, but that doesn't stop you. And then there are things like donations. There is free stuff. I don't have any. Oh, actually, here, set of headphones. Somebody sent them to me. Hey, talk about these on your show. And I'm like, well, if they're bad, I'm going to say they're bad. They're like, nope, that's fine. So that's free stuff. Many times if I go to an event, it sounds weird, but I eat for free because some people are like, hey, can I take you to lunch? And I'm like, sure. Okay, that's fine. And then the newest one, and it's about, I'd say 2 to 3 years, a little ahead of its time, is there's this thing called value for value. And it's basically, it's crowdfunding in a sense, but there are apps now that you can, it's around Bitcoin. And right there, some people are like, oh, they scream and run away and their eyes roll in the back of their head. But what's interesting is you're going to your audience and saying, hey, you can pay me absolutely nothing for this if you want. But if you found value in this, why don't you give some of that back? And so for some people, if you go, I don't know, can you give me $5? Some people are like, we're having a hard time right now, $5. And then other people are like, did you say 5,000? I got it right here in the couch cushions. And they're, so there's a show called No Agenda that Adam Curry, the guy that helped invent podcasting, does. And he has people every episode donate $1,000 because it's a really good show filled with information that you can't get anyplace else. And so that is something, I think the last time I checked, I've got, I don't know, $90 in the last couple months, because the longer they listen, the more money they give you. It's weird because it's Bitcoin. And in the same way that a penny is a very, very, very small fraction of a dollar, a Bitcoin, a very, 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 very small amount of that is called a Satoshi. And so as soon as you say Bitcoin and Satoshi, the average person goes, I have no idea what you're talking about. And I'm like, think of it like when you go to the fair and you get tokens to buy stuff. I'm like, you take your money, you buy some Satoshis, and then you give out the tokens to the shows that you like the most. So that's, like I say, it's a little ahead of its time, but if that really takes off, because the beauty of that model is now, if I don't like what you say, I can go to your sponsor and go, they said booger. I don't like the word booger. I want them gone. I want them canceled. Well, if you have a direct connection with your audience, they can't cancel you. So those are the different ways you can make money with your podcast. But it does start with growing your audience. I have a lot of people, I always say it's plan, launch, grow, monetize. And a lot of people skip plan, they just launch, and then they skip the grow and they want to monetize. They go, it just doesn't work that way.
Right there. Yeah. You plant a seed and then you harvest what you planted, not something different. So,
yeah.
All right. So what would you say is the biggest mistake? Probably lack of planning from your last thing you said, but what is the biggest mistake people make when starting a podcast?
The whole getting no feedback. They'll ask mom, like, hey, mom, listen to this podcast. Well, first things, mom is not your target audience. And mom goes, oh, look at you. You're so professional. Look at oh, my goodness. Look at the microphone and the lights. Oh, notice mom is not talking about your content. She's talking about your gear. And if you've ever seen the episode of Friends and Joey's like on TV and they're like, what are you going to say? And like, oh, you're there, but yet you're here. And oh, they lighting. And they're like, nobody wants to say, Joey, you're really awful. So you need somebody to tell you the truth, because Disney had a movie in the 90s. It was The Lone Ranger. It was starring Johnny Depp at the height of his pirate craze. And it cost like $261 million for, I think that was $250 million. And they spent $261 million promoting it. Do the math on that. It doesn't end well. And the problem was that movie was horrible. I saw it. It was horrible. Then you take a movie like The Sixth Sense, which had like a $40 million budget. And everybody that saw that movie instantly said, I got to go watch that again. And they'd call a friend. So it's, and I get it, because your first episode, you thought your 15-minute podcast was going to take you 15 minutes and it just took you 4 hours. So you're just like, I just want to put it out there. So I get that, but you need somebody to listen to it, because there's no sense promoting something that's not going to, give you the results you want. Ron Howard, right? We all know him as Opie Taylor and Richie Cunningham, but he's this brilliant director now. He's won so many awards. It's insane. But he sits in a movie with an audience, like a test audience, because he knows when they're supposed to laugh and cry and chuckle. And if they're not, it's back to the editing bay because this thing isn't ready for the public yet. So I think that's the biggest one. And the problem is people that are really good at this make it look really easy. And so they'll watch Joe Rogan just talk to his buddy for 3 hours. And, somebody gave him $200 million. They're like, well, I can talk to my buddy for 3 hours. Well, there's a lot of editing there. Oh, and that's right. Joe Rogan was on TV. He was a comic. He was a comic for 6 years before he even got his first album. So, I always just kind of politely say, please remember, you're not Joe Rogan. So it's going to take a little while.
Gotcha. So what is Libsyn and how has that helped you in this endeavor?
Libsyn is short for Liberated Syndication. If I had a time machine, I would go back and go, please don't name the company Libsyn because we get called LibSync and Lisbon a lot, but it's Liberated Syndication. And so I'd been teaching for 10 years. And once again, we had a bunch of sales guys that couldn't sell training. And so I get let go. And I was married at the time. And I was like, hey, I think I'm going to make the School of Podcasting like my full-time gig. And I got vetoed. We'll say that. And I was like, okay, well, I'd like to get a job in podcasting. And so I had known many of the people at Libsyn because your podcast is like a resume. One of the biggest advantage we talk about money is the relationships. I've talked to people that I have no business talking to. Like if I went to them and said, hey, can I pick your brain for 20 minutes? They'd be like, get out of here, kid. You bother me. But if I say, would you like to come on my podcast? Oh, sure. Where's your scheduling link? And so I was friends with people over there and I called the vice president and I said, hey, you want to have an awkward conversation? He's like, oh, okay. And I said, I got good news and bad news. And he said, oh, I'll play. What's the bad news? And I go, I just lost my job. He's like, okay. And the good news is, and I go, oh, I'm available to work for you. I said, I told you it might get awkward. And 2 weeks later, I was working for Libsyn. And so it's a podcast hosting company. It's the original one. Like they started in 2004. And so I started there as a support person, which I still do. But it was funny because the president was like, we're not using you right. Like you're a great support person, but we're not using you right. So they promoted me to the head of podcaster education. So now I do coaching, I do webinars, and I still do support. And what I love about that is now the School of Podcasting is just this super serious side hustle. And by working at Libsyn, I get a much wider view of what's going on and what's stopping people and what is confusing, which then helps me make the School of Podcasting better. The School of Podcasting, I have courses in there for Libsyn. I have courses on our competitors as well, but I have courses in there for Libsyn. So it's been a lot of fun. And my favorite thing is I get to go to these events. Now, granted, I have to stand at a booth and explain that Libsyn is short for Liberated Syndication for many hours. But at night, that's where the meetings you have in the hallways at these places is where things really, really, again, more value. And so I get to go to those for free because it's a Libsyn thing. So it's a lot of fun. And, the booth is even fun because the thing I love about that is I have my audience and I'm like, oh, you're going to, Podfest in January. I'm like, yes, just find me at the Libsyn booth. So instead of them trying to scamper, it's like, no, I'll be right here, booth 17 or whatever it is. And so it's a great way for people to then meet me in person. And of course, as soon as I do, the first thing I ask them is, what do you like about the show? And then I ask them, what do you wish I wouldn't do anymore on the show? And then I shut up. I enjoy the awkward pause. And they'll either eventually say, no, really, I love everything about it. Or they might actually come up and say, well, sometimes it's a little long. I'm like, oh, okay. Taking notes, So again, I need somebody to tell me the truth.
Wow. This is so cool to get a behind the curtain look at the reality of this. Is just very, very cool. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
You have tons of podcasts. Two of them are Ask the Coach,
yeah,
Ask the Podcast
Ask the Podcast Coach, and I have the School of Podcasting. That's kind of like my flagship one. Ask the Podcast Coach was a show I started because I wanted to play with live streaming, and I did it for about a month. And was like, okay. And my audience was like, no, don't quit. Like, you're our new Saturday morning cartoons, because I do that Saturday morning because that was the time it was available. And I was like, okay. And then I do one called Your Podcast Consultant, which is just me playing with a very short, it's like 9 minutes or less. It's just hey, if you're going to walk around the block and you want a quick podcast tip, go to podcastconsultant.com. And then I was playing with a competitor, like this new media host came on. And as you might imagine, I don't have time to do another podcast. And I'm like, how can I do a podcast that requires zero prep? And this is a horrible name, by the way, the Podcast Rodeo Show. And so if I asked you what that's about, you'd go, I don't know, the rodeo. So it has a tagline. It's like podcast reviews and first impressions. Because if you have to explain the name of your show, you picked a wrong name. So I always talk about I grab a random podcast and see how long I can hang on. So that is literally exactly what I do. I find a podcast. In some cases, people will pay me, hey, can we cut in line and can you give me impression of my show? And it's just me. And I'm like, okay, well, I don't know, what you said. The title of the episode was this. We're 8 minutes in. You're just begging your audience for money. And I'm not getting any value of this. At this point, I would hit stop, and it's all through the lens of I don't want to just be mean and tell you your baby is ugly, but sometimes I got to say your baby's kind of ugly. And so I try to find a constructive way to do that. I'm like, look, this was good. Your audio sounded great, but nobody's waiting 9 minutes for you to get to the point. So that's just some of them. Yeah.
You're a Simon, but you're not mean.
I used to be mean. That show, I don't know if it was Simon influenced, but I listened back and I go, ooh, like who? Because I'm like, that doesn't go with my brand. My brand is I'm the guy that's here to help you, and you come for help. And I'm like, yeah, that was bad. I'm like, well, you can't fix that was bad. You know what I mean? Hey, your show sucks. Oh, thanks. Can you be a little more? It's kind of hard to fix that. So I try to be like, hey, you need a pop filter because you have a bunch of plosives going into your microphone, or you can't really expect to compete with people if you have 4 people in a room and you're using one microphone. That's easy to fix. Here's a microphone I recommend for everybody. It's under $100. So yeah, the first couple of years, I don't know what I was thinking. I'll listen back and I go, that's just me being kind of mean. So I'm a kindler, gentler Dave now on that show.
Oh, we like that. Very cool. So looking ahead, what do you see podcasting 10, 20 years from now being like?
It's going to be interesting because right now there's a whole industry being invented to stalk podcasters. So this is based on advertising, and advertisers are worried about, somebody's going to say something stupid and then, your brand is going to be associated with this guy who said booger. And so there are companies now that will listen to all your episodes and then they give you a rating. And I'm not a fan of that. I'm like, I believe humans are smart. And if somebody says something I don't agree with, you can just swipe left and hit delete and never listen to that show again. I don't need somebody babysitting me and going, oh, like this one person was doing great and had all these advertisers. And then he brought Kanye West on. And Kanye at the time was having a little problem with PR. And he thought he would have a dialogue with Kanye to kind of go, what you thinking there, buddy? You're making some interesting choices. Well, dialogues are not, you can't have a dialogue in America. You can't hear both sides of the story. That's insane. And so they were like, yeah, we're a little worried about him, getting ads for it. So that's one thing I hope we kind of get a grasp on. Like, I don't know, it's just, it makes me, because that just leads to vanilla. Like, well, we're not going to say anything remotely, we're not going to have dialogues. One of my favorite ones was Joe Rogan had Ted Nugent on. And this is something you don't hear anyplace. Ted is a big hunter, big hunter guy, really loves guns, very right-wing kind of guy. And Joe had him on, and I found out that Ted Nugent's son is a vegetarian. Like, that's not a soundbite that they're going to put on CNN or Fox or anybody like that. So that's the one thing I see coming along. But I also wonder, I said this whole thing with the streaming Bitcoin, if that takes off, that could be really interesting because now I don't think ads are ever going to go away. I know a lot of people that are making decent money with ads and they're completely safe. They're not doing anything. They're just entertaining. So by all means, ads is a way of making money. But I like the streaming Bitcoin thing because it is, if we can make it just a little easier to get involved and educate the general public that this isn't some sort of weird scam, that'll be interesting. But it just keeps getting bigger and bigger. and it gets easier and easier. I have none on my desk right now, but there's a device that, I don't know, 7 years ago would have been about $800, and it's now $200, and it does more than the one from 5 years ago. So things keep getting easier and easier. I'm using a piece of equipment right now that was designed specifically for podcasters that, 10 years ago didn't exist because there weren't that many. And so it just keeps getting easier and easier and bigger and bigger. And in fact, right now, the number of people starting new podcasts is actually taking an ever so slight dip, but the audience, the people that are listening, is going up. Well, if you do the math on that, that means more listeners, less podcasts means more listeners for you. So it's a great time to jump into the pool, and it'll be fun because we're in October as we record this. So in 3 months, everybody and their brother is going to say, "This is the year I start a podcast." So jump in now before they do.
Okay. So last question. Do you have any that just pop out when I ask you this question? The first one that pops out, really cool stories about someone that you helped in with their podcast.
Yeah. I have two. I'll try to make them quick. One was Marcy Rosenbaum. And so she called me up and she says, "I want to start a podcast, but I can't do it because I hate tech and tech hates me." And I'm like, "Oh, we can do this." And Marcy was a person that was going to retire in a few years. She kind of wanted to start something because she had a huge amount of knowledge and she wanted to start this podcast. Long story short, I just said, "Okay, we're going to baby step this through this. We're going to get your artwork. We're going to get your microphone." And I said, "Okay, well, we're going to submit your show." I said, "You'll show up in Apple in a couple days." And she calls me up crying. And I go, "Marcy, what?" She's like, "I can't." I'm like, "Marcy, what's the problem?" She goes, "I'm in iTunes." And I go, "Yeah, I said it'd take you. No, I'm in iTunes." And I go, "Yeah." She goes, "No, you don't get it." And I go, "What?" She goes, "I told you I couldn't do this and you said I could. And now I did. I'm in iTunes." And I was like, "Yeah, congratulations." So that was one that touched my heart. But the one that I still can't believe is, this guy emailed me, and in fact, I need to call him. I didn't call him yesterday. He sent me an email, and he said, "Hey, I just want to let you know, I heard your podcast where you say that having a podcast can maybe give you a purpose in life." And he goes, "But I lost my friend of 20 years. I lost my job of 20 years. I was about 95% sure I had cancer, and I decided since Halloween was my favorite holiday, I was going to take my gun and blow my brains out." And he goes, "But I heard your show about that might give you a purpose. So I started a podcast." He goes, "I got some help, and I just want to let you know I credit you with saving my life." And it's you have no idea how frustrated I am right now because it dawned on me yesterday was Halloween and I didn't call him. I've called him almost every year because he had his phone number in his signature. So I called him on Halloween, kind of making a light joke. And I'm like, "Hey, this is Dave Jackson." He goes, "It is not." I go, "It is." And he goes, "What are you doing?" And I go, "Dude, I need all the listeners I can get. I cannot have my listeners, killing themselves on Halloween." And so I've called him almost every year, except this year, because I just dawned on him like, "Oh, today's November 1st. I didn't call him." So that's one that when I started, I'd just gone through a divorce. I'd gone through a bankruptcy. I was living in my brother's basement next to a water heater in the same room with the furnace. And, you don't have to be great to start, but you do have to start to be great. And when I started that, I didn't ever have the idea that somebody would email me someday and go, "You saved my life." I'm talking about microphones and bandwidth, and so you just never know who's listening and what your impact's going to be.
That is so incredibly cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. And also thank you for talking about how you were broke and living in your brother's basement next to the water heater, because guys out there, I'm talking to my listeners right now, all successful people are not just lucky. They all work their tails off constantly. And are you done growing?
No, not at all. My one of my mantras is constant improvement. So right now I'm trying to learn Spanish, and aside from I eat apples, yo como manzanas, that's about as far as I've got right now. But I spend 5 to 10 minutes a day learning a new word. So in a couple of years I'll be able to say more than I eat apples. But I'm always trying to improve. When being the teacher in me, the minute you stop learning something new, you're going backwards because life's not standing still. And so I always try to learn something new. I'm always, when I'm not listening to a podcast, I'm listening to a book, so it's just something. Plus I have two sides of the coin. One, my dad's side of the family, everybody gets Alzheimer's, and my mom's side of the family, everybody lives to be like 102. So I'm trying to keep my brain active and hopefully pull in some of mom's genes as I get older.
There you go. Well, you guys, it's very easy to find this man on social media everywhere. But Dave, where would you like them to start?
Yeah, the best place is schoolofpodcasting.com. You can contact me there. You can find out my old episodes. There's resources there. It's all there at schoolofpodcasting.com.
Outstanding. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you. This is awesome.